And get ready.
Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Dave, do we need to do a sound test or are we good to go?
You're good.
All right. This Torah portion is really one of the favorite, I think, for a lot of us. Growing up, I grew up listening to Your Story Hour. Maybe you guys are familiar with Uncle Dan and Aunt Sue. At one point in time as a child, I had the entire tape memorized verbatim of the story, and it just really became my favorite. So for me, and now as a scholar, looking at this historically, I often wondered, this is the story of Joseph, but how did it take place in real life? Can we identify Joseph? And I find that the historical background, understanding the historical setting, really adds a lot to how we see Scripture. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is present the historical background for Joseph. Can we identify him and see how that illuminates Scripture? So the way that we currently understand Egyptian chronology, and let me say currently understand, because as new discoveries are made, as our knowledge is sharpened and possibilities are eliminated, this scenario could possibly change. But as the Egyptian chronology is currently understood, Joseph, or the chronology in Scripture, lines up around 1991 with the king of the very first king of the Middle Kingdom, whose name was Amenhotep I. Now, this began the 12th dynasty. He had a vizier. And it's funny when we look at viziers, and let me tell you what a vizier was. He was basically a prime minister. So you had other functions that fell under him, and everybody reported to this prime minister type of authority. And before this vizier, and his name is Antequifer, and I could be massacring the name, but it is an Egyptian name, and it's the best I can do with it right now.
For a Southern girl.
That's right, for a Southern girl. So the Antequifer, before him, the viziers are not really recorded. There's really nothing that we know about him. When he comes into office, all of a sudden there's this monumental, massive evidence of his administration and what he did. So let me share with you some particular aspects of this particular vizier that fits the scriptural account. First of all, his origins are unknown. Other viziers of Egypt, we know their birth, we know their parents, we know whether they were from far south like Nubia, which is not very often, but we know kind of the families where they came from, if they had served in other capacities in the administration before being promoted. In the Old Kingdom, you had stewards that became governors and they assumed a lot of power. So some of these people were promoted to vizier. It is often debated that they were promoted in order to bring some sort of cohesion and some sort of unity to the empire. But of Antequifer, we know that his origins are unknown. His father is unknown, where fathers are usually recognized. Before he is appointed vizier, there's an attack that is made on Pharaoh. This plot against him. You know, this resonates with the story of Joseph, where you have the butler, the chief of the butler and baker. These probably would have been military positions where a plot was discovered and they were put into prison. So that resonates with the story of Joseph and Antequifer. The other thing is that Antequifer is referred to as a foster child of the king, as though his family has been totally forgotten. When he marries a priestess of Hathor named Zatzazobek. So, you know, we're told that Joseph is given to marry the daughter of the high priest at On. So some of these things really kind of converge and overlap in the similarities. The name itself, Antef, means the exalted one. And it's interesting, too, that only during the administration of Antequifer do we find that some of these administration begins to answer to the vizier. Before this, they really don't. Specifically, the stewards answer to him in building projects. Now, we read in Scripture that Joseph instigated building projects in store cities and other capacities to withstand the years of famine, where these projects were not needed before them. And so it's very interesting that this kind of expanding of power, this centralization, all resonate with both Antiphar as well as in the story of Joseph. Now, one thing that's interesting that Scripture tells us is part of this parsha this week, and this is Genesis 47:20. It says that, and Joseph brought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field because the famine prevailed over them. So the land of Egypt became Pharaoh's. In Egyptian history, anytime you read Egyptian history, there is always this idea that the land belongs to Pharaoh. And in Scripture, it makes it sound as though Joseph is kind of the instigator of this, which is probably not wholly accurate, but it is probably accurate that under Joseph's administration, he expanded the powers of Pharaoh. You know, the Middle Kingdom was very prosperous, very strong because of the centralization that was installed under Amenhotep I and his son, the vizier Antiphar. His administration began with Amenhotep, but it continued through his son. So he would have reigned under two monarchs. The other thing, when Joseph brings his family to Egypt, and this really kind of gets into the story of the Exodus, it's very fascinating that when Joseph brings his family before Pharaoh, Pharaoh says to him, and this is Genesis 47, verse 6, Pharaoh says, "The land of Egypt is before you. In the best of the land, make your father and your brethren to live. In the land of Goshen, let them dwell. If you know any man of industry among them, make them rulers over my cattle." So what we find is that Joseph's brothers, not only is Joseph a vizier under the crown, under Pharaoh, but some of his brothers begin to work for the administration in a shepherding capacity. Well, now let's fast forward 400 years to the Exodus. In Mose, which would have been one of the last kings of the I think it was 17th dynasty, because you had a lot of competing dynasties at the same time. But he would have been one of the last monarchs of the Theban dynasties. What had occurred in the interim, remember the Exodus story there says there arose another king who knew not Joseph. Well, this other king wasn't just a king, it was a group of kings. It was a totally different people that arose and took power in the Delta, the northern region. And your traditional kings of Egypt that Joseph would have ruled under had to retreat south to Thebes. They had lost their power in the north, and these other kings that were really not well versed in Egyptian history, something that was unprecedented for your traditional Egyptian monarch, had to retire south. So you have these other kings that arise to power in the north. They install their own monarchy. There's evidence that for a while they had elected officials before it became an actual pharaonic administration. So, but what happens is these shepherds in the north, shortly before the Exodus, continue strong relations with the Theban dynasty that had retired down south. And one thing that Moses Behun Stella tells us is that the rulers of the land didn't have to worry about their flocks shepherding in the north. There were strong ties, relations, to the point that even though they were losing revenues and they were having to pay all these tribute to use the Nile, which was their right, basically, it was kind of their birthright, they were having to pay tribute to these foreign kings. They still were able to shepherd their flocks. They still had the produce. They had the income from those. And that may indicate that the Hebrews had this political alliance with the southern kings. So then we look at the story of Moses and how the Hebrews were then genocide occurred, or infanticide occurred because of this alliance with the southern kings, whereby the Hebrews then became a liability to the kings of the north that had usurped the power and overtaken the Delta region. So that's just kind of the historical background. And the other thing that I find very interesting is that some of the political things, some of the administrative things that Joseph put into place, this very strong centralized government where he buys the land of Egypt during the famine. And he says that you now belong to Pharaoh. Well, what we know in Egyptian history, and it's more in the Egyptian psyche, the way that they viewed themselves, was that every year, especially if you were part of the poor people of the land, you work for Pharaoh for at least 6 months out of the year as part of the corvée labor force. Foreigners were especially targeted for working on Pharaoh's monuments and other public works, whether it was, harvesting of fields or whether it was other things to support the livelihood and the well-being of the people. So in many ways, some of the things that Joseph put into place ended up oppressing his brothers and his descendants later on in Israel's history. Now, one of the last things, as far as the historical background, that I think is very interesting with this story and this parsha is in Genesis 47, verses 11 and 12. It talks about Joseph settling his brothers in the land of Egypt. And it says, and in the best part of the land, in the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Now, a lot of people, as scholars that deal with validity issues, they say at no point, even Van Setters, for instance, who is a very harsh critic of the scriptural history, no one recognizes Ramses as being the Pharaoh in power at the time of Joseph. So what you have is a very anachronistic reference to Ramses within the story of Joseph. So how does this work? Why is it there? Well, when we go through Israel's history and we find the different editing phases that occurred in the nation's archives, we find that Deborah tells us that her and her scribes did a lot of work in codifying and bringing the records up to date during her administration. And why this becomes relevant and why we find this reference to Ramses here is that Deborah and her scribes lived around 1275 during the reigns of Ramses. So to make these texts not valid, but to make them relevant for the people that lived in her day. Today when we write, we might refer to President Obama, we might refer to Putin, we might refer to Cameron or somebody else in world history as sort of a context because that's the world that we live in. Deborah's scribes really are no different. They refer to Ramses within the story of Joseph because Israel would have seen the capital, where Joseph lived. They would have seen where Israel had exodus from as the land of Ramses because that was the reigning monarch. Things that had preceded before were no longer valid. Today, when we look at London or we look at different places in Europe, we refer to them as their modern names. We don't refer to them as the names or the territories which would have been held under Roman occupation. The same thing for Deborah. It would have been a bringing up of the nation's history and making it relevant. So, all right, so now to delve into kind of the fun parts of the Torah portion with kind of that historical background and the historical setting. When we look at Joseph's life, his early life with his father, he's favored. This is a kid that most of us would be overjoyed to have as our son, or even as the personality and everything about him as our daughter. Very beloved of his father, just really this close relationship. But we also get some hints in the text that there was a lot of pride, perhaps some arrogancy. His brothers called him a dreamer. He was very favored by his father, to the point where his brothers said, "This is unfair." And there was this jealousy and this hatred because of this unfair relationship. So what we find in Scripture is that whether it's in our personal lives or whether it's community or nationally, when there are these, say, sins of the heart, they don't necessarily manifest themselves into a physical action, but they're harbored in the heart. Yahweh often sends testing. Sometimes the testing is to see if we're going to go follow our sin to its logical conclusion, which will be some sort of physical action. Other times he tests us and he refines us to prepare us for something that is greater than ourselves, a task that is further beyond. So what we find in Joseph's life is that Yahweh put him in the beginning. He's sold into slavery. He's betrayed by his brothers. He's put into this very menial position. And what Asaph tells us is that we're often put in slippery places. And even before Asaph, Moses tells us that Yahweh tests us He's always testing us to see if we will follow him or if we will go our own way. If you look at Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, it says that, and this is referring to the generation that came out of Egypt, the generation whose heart was not faithful with Yahweh. They rebelled 10 different times in the wilderness. And in Deuteronomy 8:2, Moses says, "And you will remember all the way that Yahweh your God led you these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you, to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." So a lot of this proving of Joseph in the early years was to see if his heart would remain faithful with Yahweh. Was he up to the task? Would he be discouraged? Would he give up? Would he just simply assimilate? Or would he stay faithful? So, and notice even within the story of Joseph, although sin may originate in the heart, Yahweh doesn't take any physical action until it manifests into a physical action. And this is where Asaph says, this is Psalm 73, verses 8 through 19. And I think that this is a psalm that of any of them provides so much wisdom and understanding. When we look at world history and we ask why, I think this is or even in our personal lives so many times, and we ask why. Why am I going through this? Why is there this travesty, or why is there this hardship? I think Asaph really provides the answer. Now, Asaph is specifically discussing a very wicked generation in Israel's history. And he says, "They are corrupt, and they speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. They set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walks through the earth. Therefore the people are returned hither." Now this is talking about Isaiah and Asaph also build on this idea of Israel returning during the Second Temple period. They return hither, and waters of a full cup are wrung out to them. And they say, "How does God know? How is there knowledge of the Most High? Behold, these are the ungodly who prosper in the world. They increase riches." You know, we read during the Second Temple period about these certain sects, the leaders of the Jews that really oppress their brothers. They increase in riches while their average citizen becomes very, very poor. He says, "Truly I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocency. For all the day long I have been plagued, and I have been chastised every morning. If I say I will speak thus, behold, I should offend against the generation of your children. When I sought to know this, it was too painful for me. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. Surely you did set them in slippery places. You cast them down into destruction. How they are wrought into desolation, as in a moment they are utterly consumed with terrors." So what we learn from this is that when there is sin in our heart, God puts us in slippery places to see which way we will choose, which way will we go. He seeks to prove us. He's always wanting to know, who are you? You know, we look at us wanting to know God, and we're saying how much we want to know him. But at the same time, he is wanting to know us just as equally. And he does that by putting us in these slippery places. And it is really almost this crucible method. You know, we know from science that when we have a substance and we want to know how that substance will react, chemists will put it in a crucible, and it will put either at heat or some sort of pressure or force to see how this substance will react under pressure. You know, Yahweh really does the same thing with us. He puts us sometimes in pressurized situations to see how we will react. You know, Joseph, he had the pressure of being a slave. And what did he do with that pressure? He rose above his situation. He remained faithful. He climbed to the top where he was the head. He was the steward of Potiphar's entire household. But right when he gets to the pinnacle, right when he thinks he has come to the point where he has achieved this level of respect and this level of honor within his society, he's brought low again. And he's brought low by Potiphar's wife. But what is the purpose of Yahweh's refining of Joseph, Yahweh's refining of the nation of Israel, or Yahweh's refining of us? You know, it really goes so much more beyond the individual. And Isaiah begins to tell us the purpose of this. This is Isaiah 48, verses 8 through 11. And this is again referring to ancient Israel. And he says, "I knew that you would deal very treacherously, and was called a transgressor from the womb. For my name's sake I will defer my anger, and my praise I will refrain for you, that I cut you not off. Behold, I have refined you, but not with silver. I have chosen you in the furnace of affliction. For my own name's sake, even my own name, I will do it. For how should my name be polluted? And I will not give my glory to another. So we find that Yahweh puts us in this furnace of affliction. He applies pressure. He applies maybe some hardships that are not comfortable to us to see which way we will choose. Will we remain faithful? Will our heart stay with him? And as Joseph, will we rise above the situation? So, and with Joseph, in many ways, this affliction really took away his iniquity that he may have had as a youth. The pridefulness, the arrogancy, maybe even a lot of the hatred that he held towards his brother was really healed through going through the process of affliction. And I think it's really the same thing with Israel. Israel is healed through the affliction that the nation has gone through with the Inquisitions, with the Holocaust. It has brought us to a point where we are closer to Yahovah in our personal lives, our personal walks, and as a community in seeking him. And Isaiah echoes this in Isaiah 13:11-12. Yahweh says, I will punish the world for the evil and the wicked for their iniquity, and I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease. You look at how Yahweh healed Joseph's pride, his arrogancy. It was through humbling him through very hard experiences. He says, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man more than the wedge of Ophir. It took these trials, it took these afflictions for Joseph to be humbled, to be able to eventually forgive his brothers and to seek peace when the time came. And through all this, we can see that Yahweh's ultimate purpose is to teach us. It's not to destroy, but it is to restore, to give us the heart, to give us the attitude and the perseverance that is needed. Elihu in Job 34:11 really sums it up best. He says, yes, he renders a man according to his ways, and as each of them does, in a man's paths he will find them. So when we come to the point as Joseph, when we come to the point where we can forgive, when we can see the best interest of our brothers, of our nations, when we can go beyond the self and we can see what is needed, it really becomes that point in time where the nation of Israel and its leaders are ready for this type of restoration. And one of the things that I don't know about you, but I become very, perturbed with is in these Hollywood depictions of Joseph, or in different stories of Joseph being this arbitrary, very emotional, sullen, sulky brother who just tests his brothers at will. He just gives them these trials and these afflictions just so he can, almost as revenge for what he went through for all of his 22 years of suffering. And what we find when we understand the principles by which Yahweh tries and he refines the hearts of humanity is that is not at all the case. Joseph uses this crucible method. He uses this trial and affliction with his brothers in the same manner that Yahovah has used it with him. He puts his brothers in very precarious situations. He puts a lot of pressure on them. And what does he use? He uses their sin. He uses their Achilles heel, their jealousy of him, that he knows that if it was of him, it must also be of Benjamin. He uses the very thing that is the sore point in their lives to test them. You hear the murmurings with the very first couple times that they're tested. Oh, this is because of the sin. This is what we did with Joseph. It's coming back to haunt us. So it's not as though his brothers have lived the last 22 years in peace. They've been afflicted day and night by what they've done to their Joseph, what's happened to him, where is he? But even more than that, they've seen their father's grief. They've seen the hardship and the heartache that their father has dealt with. And in many ways, I think that we are a lot like Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers called out for the unfairness that had been between Joseph and Jacob, that unfair relationship. But Micah and Ezekiel tell us of a similar charges that Israel made against Jehovah. They claim that there was an unfair law that was given to us. Micah 6:2-4, Israel says, "Behold, your way is unequal. You've given me this law that cannot be followed." And Yahweh says, "Try my controversy. See if I've given you a way that leads to death or a way that indeed lives to life. See if it is unfair or if it is fair." And he says, I have been righteous in all my dealings with you. And it's kind of the same thing that we see playing with Joseph, in that even though there is this claim of unfairness, it has a purpose, and that it is not unfair at all, but that there is a better and there is a future and there is a purpose to the overall plan. For Joseph's brothers, they were separated. They were separated for him for a long period of time. And in many ways, it's as though his face was hidden from them, in the same way that Yahweh's face has been hidden from us. And I think that the testing of Joseph's brothers, whether it was the testing of taking Simeon, putting him in jail, they passed that test. Then he takes and he says, "Bring your brother." He has to see it for themselves. Has this sin been healed in their lives, or does it still exist? Joseph doesn't reveal himself. He doesn't, reveal who he is in the first few stages of testing. He has to see that they're worthy. He has to see that they are capable of passing the test, that their jealousy, their hatred, and their envy has been healed. So then when they come back the second year, which would have been probably a whole year later because it's the second year into the famine, he takes and he puts them in a situation. He puts them exerts this pressure on them where he gives Benjamin 5 times as much. He shows all this preference to Benjamin. He sits at another table and he watches. How are his brothers going to react? What is their conversation? They don't know that he can hear them. They don't know that they can understand and see what's going on. But he's able to see and to judge wisely the heart, the attitude, everything that goes on with his brothers. So when they pass every single test, and then it comes up to the very end, it comes up to the point where the very last test is given, and they have passed this last test. He has said, "Leave your brother Benjamin. All of you can go home. I'll take away from you the one that is hated, the one that you're jealous of, even as you did with me." But they're not willing. They stand up. So they pass this final test. It's at that point that Joseph then reveals himself. And I often think that it's very similar to the testing and the refining that Jehovah does with us. He's not going to reveal himself in the first few phases of testing. We have been backsliding. We have followed other gods for so many years that he's going to wait and make sure through all the testing that we are finally willing, we're finally capable, we are finally sincere, and we are faithful to his covenant that our ancestors have not. So it isn't until those final tests are done that he finally reveals himself. He no longer hides his face. So, and the favorite part, I think, of this parsha is where we come to the point where Joseph actually reveals himself. Can you imagine being in this room and Joseph says, "Let everyone clear this room"? Here you have gone, and this is from the perspective of Joseph's brothers. You've gone through all this testing. You have been brought back to Egypt. Your brother has been told that he has to stay. And you know that this is where your father's heart lives. You know that this is the only thing that he has yet to hold on to Rachel. This is like the love of his life and the only thing that he has to hold on to her. And you've been told that he has to stay there and you cannot leave. You are there to defend your brother to the death. And you're standing there, and all of a sudden here is Pharaoh saying, "Let every man except these Hebrews leave the room." You see on both sides of the court, everybody scrambling to get out. And you're thinking, this is the end. That he is about to slaughter us here. And now he doesn't want his court to see the blood that is shed. This is it. We're going to say our prayers because it's over. But then what happens? He takes and he says a name that The brothers have not dared speak for years. This is a name that they wouldn't even dare touch their lips because of what it meant. And he says, come near to me. He says, I am Yosef. I am Joseph. Can you imagine how their hair must have stood on end? How he must have, his brothers just stand there in total shock. And he doesn't send them away. And it isn't the judgment they expected. Rather, he brings them close to him and he restores them. And he says, I'm Joseph. Come near to me. He acknowledges their sin. He says, yes, you did sell me into slavery. Yes, you did sin against me. But what you did in evil, Yehovah meant it for good. And he takes and he just totally changes the entire scenario. And, of course, Benjamin's standing there. If he has not heard the story by now, all the little secrets that have been told among the brothers, he's going, wait, you did what? And but then he sees the way that Joseph is open and accepting to them. And, I think it's going to be much like this when Yehovah reveals himself to us. We are looking for this day of Yahweh. We're looking for this day of judgment when Yahweh returns to us. But what if that doesn't happen? What if instead of judgment, Yahweh gives us the restoration that Joseph gave to his brothers? Even though we've sinned against him, what if he restores us as Joseph restored his brothers? And, it's the story of Joseph, I think, is just so rich and full of this maturity that Joseph exhibits. It's almost as though the 22 years that his brothers have spent in agonizing and in guilt and in just this sorrow of what they have done to Joseph has in itself, this pressure of affliction, has affected its own healing. Because what happens with his brothers? They're no longer jealous. They're no longer angry. They're no longer revengeful. Their envy has been healed. And in the very same way, I think that is in our lives and in the history of Israel throughout the diaspora that has occurred. And in Genesis 45:1, I think we just have to read this story because it's just so full of this hope that I think his brothers see. Joseph says, now therefore do not be grieved nor angry with yourselves that you have sold me here. For God did send me here before you to preserve life. And for these 2 years has the famine been in the land. And yet there are 5 years in which there shall be no earing or harvest. And God sent me before you to prepare for you posterity in the earth. Notice how Joseph is able to arise above his situation. He's able to arise above his years of affliction. He's able to arise above the hurt that was perpetrated by his brothers, to see the big picture, to see the overall plan of salvation that Yehovah had in his life and in the lives of his brothers. He says, so now it was not that you that sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Quickly go you to my father and say to him, thus says Joseph, God has made me lord in Egypt. Come to me and do not tarry. For you shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be close to me, you and your children and your children's children, for your flocks and your herds and all that you have. And I will nourish you here, for there is yet 5 more years of famine, lest you and your household come to poverty. I cannot even imagine the relief that his brothers must have felt. Knowing, that there's a certain thing as karma. His brothers knew this in their father's life. His father had deceived Isaac into receiving the blessing. His father had been deceived into marrying a woman he had not loved. And then his father was again, the harshest sentence of all, deceived into believing his son was dead. His sons know that this karma is going to eventually catch up with them. They know that eventually there's a judgment that is awaiting them and that they can't escape it. That's what they utter again before Joseph the first couple times they are brought. But instead of judgment, they're given this salvation of Egypt. They're giving freedom from affliction, and their burden is set free when Joseph speaks to them. And, you know, in so many ways, this parallels the spiritual famine that we have endured with the lack of word of Yahweh. Amos 8:11 talks about that we would experience a famine, not a famine of food, but a famine for hearing the word of Yahweh, of hearing it from his lips. You know, the last time that we heard Yahweh speak as a nation was within the days of Haggai and Zechariah. That would have been right around 515 BCE. That's 25, next year will mark 2,500 years that we have been without the word of Yahweh. And it's very interesting that when Yahweh reveals himself, it is with the intention of drawing us near, drawing us closer to him, not for judgment, but for salvation. You know, as the story of Joseph proceeds, his brothers have this incredible story, this incredible news to share with their father. His son that he believed was dead is alive. But more than that, come to Egypt. You know, it's time to move. It's time to get going. But, you know, I think of anyone in this story, I can identify with Jacob the most. Because what happens when his sons return to him? They say, Joseph is alive. And he looks at them as though they have lost their minds. He says, no. And he does not want to believe it. The thing that he wants more than anything else in life, he refuses to believe. His heart fails him. And it specifically says that his heart fainted. And Genesis, let's read it. It says Genesis 45, verses 25 and 26. And they went up out of Egypt, and they came to the land of Canaan unto Joseph their father, and told them, saying, Joseph is alive. He is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. You know, I can relate to that. Look at us. We've been deceived with religion over and over and over again. We've been told, oh, this religion is truth, or this scripture is truth. But as we keep searching, we find that, okay, this isn't what we thought it was, and we believed a lie. We go through this process so many times that we become skeptical. We become cynical. And I think that we lose hope. We lose hope that this message is for our day, that this message is some 100,000 generations in the future. And we don't believe that the time of restoration, the time of reconciliation is for our day. But when I look at Joseph, or when I look at Jacob, how did he believe again? What gave him hope? And when we continue in Genesis 45, do you know how Jacob believed? Do you know how he began to have hope again? Scripture says, he saw evidence that Joseph lived. He saw carts, horses, and clothing, something that only his son, if he was in a very influential power, could give him. It was when he saw evidence that Joseph existed, that his heart revived. He began to hope again. And I do believe that it is that way for us today. Our hearts will revive. Our hope will revive when we see evidence of Yahweh's existence, when we see his hand working in not only our personal lives, but the lives of our community. And he starts to make this restoration not a thing that we just talk about, but a thing that actually happens. And, you know, this idea of hope is something that resonates with Scripture. Because when Yahweh's plan of salvation is revealed to Jacob, when Jacob didn't know that Yahweh was sending Joseph ahead to prepare for the time for his family to come to Egypt, it had been prophesied in the Promised Land Covenant in Genesis 12, where Yahweh told Abraham, I will bring your people, and they shall be afflicted for 400 years. And the land that afflicts them I will judge, and I will bring them out with great substance. They knew that prophecy. They knew it was time for that prophecy, but they had really lost hope. It had lost context. It had lost meaning for Jacob and for his children. They had no idea that this thing in this small corner of their world was being prepared for them, being prepared for their return, a return to Egypt. But for them, it was a time of salvation from the famine that existed. But Yahweh doesn't leave Jacob just out wondering. He gives Jacob a specific covenant of hope hope that the last 22 years have not been in vain, and hope that what he has seen will indeed occur. So in Genesis 46, verse 2, it says that Jacob acted on this hope. And it says, and Israel took his journey and all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto God of his father. And oftentimes when the patriarchs do this, this is kind of the patriarch's way of asking to ratify and to acknowledge the covenants that exist, the patriarchal covenants. It says, and Yahweh spoke unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here am I. And he said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up out of Egypt again. And Joseph shall put his hands on your eyes. Yahweh didn't leave Jacob wondering if he would see his son again. Once the plan had been revealed, once this Joseph was made known, it is promised this immediacy. In your lifetime, you will touch your son, flesh and bones. You will see it occur. And this is not the only promise of immediacy that is given in Scripture. Right after the circumcision covenant is given to Abraham, Yahweh sends some messengers to talk to Abraham in Genesis 17 and 18. And when the time has come that Isaac should be born, Yahweh no longer leaves Abraham, although Abraham has wondered for at least 13 years when this child of promise is going to be born. He no longer leaves him wondering anymore. And in Genesis 18, verse 13, it says, and Yahweh said to Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, I shall surely bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard for Yahweh? In the time appointed I will return to you, and according to this time of life, Sarah will have a son. Well, when we go through their ages, we find that Abraham was 99 years old, and that Isaac was born when he was 100. So Yahweh gave him hope of this promise being fulfilled within a year of the promise being given. He says, a year from now you will have a son. The same thing with Jacob. We see this idea of hope being stirred up within the patriarchs, that once the promise is given, once it is saying, hey, now is the time, it doesn't wait off. It is very much occurs in their lifetime because that covenant is given, that covenant of hope. So why does Yahweh say to Jacob, or why does he say to Abraham, it's going to occur now? Now is the time to believe. Now is the time to hope. I think that Solomon gives us some insight into that. And in Proverbs 13:12, he writes, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when the desire comes, it's a tree of life. Yahweh wanted Jacob to enjoy the reunion, the restoration that was at hand between him and his son. Those 22 years can be forgotten and be overshadowed by the joy that comes with the restoration. So, what is the question then becomes, as we work through these stories, these ancient stories, does God have a word of hope for us today? Is there something in Scripture that we can take hold on and that we can claim is hope for us today, and that something we can share and instill in our children? And the answer is yes. There is not just a word of hope, but it is a law of hope in Torah. And if you will turn to Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 8, this is a text that speaks to us today. And Yahweh says, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, you will call them to mind among the nations, whither Yahweh your God has driven you. And you will return to Yahweh your God and obey his voice according to all that I have commanded you this day, you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul. Now let me ask you, today we are scattered among all nations. We are driven to the four corners of the earth. Are you and I, are we seeking Yahovah? Are we returning to him? Are we fulfilling this ancient promise? If we are fulfilling this ancient promise, then there is hope. But notice what he promises. It says, then Yahweh your God will turn your captivity and will have compassion on you. And he will return and gather you from all nations where Yahweh your God has scattered you. If you be driven out to the outmost parts of heaven, From thence Yahweh your God will gather you, and from thence will he fetch you. It doesn't say that we will fetch ourselves. It doesn't say that this is something that we will do. You know, the first Exodus, that was not something that Israel did. Israel didn't affect the plagues. Israel did not affect the crossing of the sea. Israel did not affect the deliverance from Pharaoh's army. You know, Yahweh says that he raised Pharaoh up so that his name, his fame, and his glory could be proclaimed throughout the earth. The same thing with the latter-day covenant. You know, Yahweh doesn't change. Throughout Ezekiel, he talks about his name being sanctified in Israel's restoration. His name is sanctified in fulfilling the ancient covenants that have yet to be fulfilled due to Israel's disobedience. But when Israel becomes faithful to him, when Israel returns with all her heart and soul to obey, then Yahweh can act. Then Yahweh can sanctify us to the land, and by sanctifying us to the land, he sanctifies himself. Says, and in verse 5, and Yahweh your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will do you good and multiply you above your fathers. And Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, that you may live with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live in his sight. So there is this word of hope. There is this promise that if we will return, Yahovah, if he is faithful, if he is righteous, he will restore. You know, Ezekiel looks to the law. In Isaiah 8:20, he says, to the law and the testimony. Light is given according to the law and the testimony. And Ezekiel looked to that. And in Ezekiel 37, he says, and, I'm going to use these here for illustrations. He talks about taking the sticks of Joseph and the sticks of Judah, and he talks about making them one. Let's see, and I did this really well earlier, but doing it now, let's see if I can do it. He talks about making them one in his hand. And he says that I will take the stick of Joseph and the stick of Ephraim from the house of his companions, and join them one to another in one stick, and they shall become one in your hand. So this is the future. It's not a division. It is a unity of both nations being restored and living in his sight. And in verse 21, Ezekiel 37:21, it says, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whether they be gone. Are we today living among the heathen? Are we today scattered? It says, and I will gather them on every side and bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land of the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all, and they shall no longer be divided into two nations. They will no longer be divided into two kingdoms anymore. Verse 26, I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it shall be an everlasting covenant with them. And I will place them and multiply them, and set my sanctuary among them. Peace doesn't come. Unity, a united nation, does not come by wishful thinking. Doesn't come by believing that it will occur. It comes by studying, by reasoning together, and by creating your heart, creating your mind to be in line with the philosophies, the precepts, the teachings of Yahweh's constitutional law. It is that constitution in and of itself that has the power to affect the unity that is promised in Ezekiel. So there is this idea that if we stand faithful, if we will pass all the testing that Yahweh does for us, then if Yahweh is righteous, he will give us hope of his salvation, that it won't be deferred generation after generation and just live blindly as some vain hope that will eventually be fulfilled. Isaiah builds on this. In Isaiah 51, verse 4, he says, listen to me, my people, and give ear to me, O my nation. For a law shall proceed from me, and I will make my judgment rest for a light of the people. So when is it that Yahweh's salvation and his law comes from him? When do these things happen? It happens when we see his judgment resting as a light for the people. And in verse 5, he says, my righteousness is near, my salvation is gone forth, and my arms shall judge the people, and the isles will wait on me, and in my arms shall they trust. Lift your eyes to the heavens and look upon the earth beneath. For the heavens shall vanish away like smoke, and the earth shall wax old like a garment. For they that dwell therein shall die in like manner. But what does not change? Though all the other things change, but my salvation shall be forever, and my righteousness shall not be abolished. So there's this idea of Yahweh being sanctified and us knowing, you and I knowing, his judgments that he has done throughout Earth's history. That these judgments show us and cause us to understand almost for the first time that he is righteous. That he is an Elohim that judges righteously. And that all of the affliction, all of the pressure that we have been in through this 2,500 years of refining and into making us this gold of Ophir have not been in vain. They've served a purpose. And like Joseph's brothers, we can look back at our affliction and we can see that the affliction, the things that we've grappled with, our hopes, our dreams, our guilt, our wanting to please Yahweh, those things have affected its own healing. It's brought us to a place where we can be healed and where we can be ready for the salvation that is to come. You know, when we see Yahweh's righteousness and when we finally understand what it means for Yahweh to be righteous, we are at this point, this pinnacle almost, where hope is given. Isaiah 25 verses 6 through 9 continues to build on this. That Yahweh promises. He says, and he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering that is cast over all people and the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death in victory, and Yahweh your God will wipe away tears from the faces, and the rebuke of his people shall he take away from off all the earth, for Yahovah has spoken it. And it shall be said in that day, lo, this is our God, we have waited for him, and he will save us. This is Yahweh, we have waited for him, and we will be glad and rejoice in his salvation. When Yahweh reveals himself to us, he speaks to us once more. It is the joy of his salvation, that his salvation will not be delayed, that the salvation has come. So we have this hope, an ancient hope that is given to us in a law, that is given to us in a testimony that says when we return, salvation will not be far off. So we have much to be rejoicing, we have much to be glad in. So take hold of this hope and pray for it. Take hold even as taking hold of a garment and not letting go. You know, there is this concept that Yahweh will not turn from us if we do not let go. Even as Jacob wrestled with an angel, take hold and prevail with Yahweh, prevail with Elohim, so that in the end, this blessing will be far more exceed hope. It will become reality. Shabbat Shalom.
Amen.